Good day, philosophers. We just finished off a discussion of Plato's Timaeus, where we encountered Plato's definition of time, right? And time was fundamentally connected to change, right? Time is this description of how things exist in a changing world, where there is this passage from what was to what will be, but things simply don't just exist. Remember, ultimately, that when we think about time, we're making a metaphysical distinction. However, Plato distinguished time from eternity, and he posited this notion that there is some way of thinking about a sort of changeless existence in which there is no passage from what was and what will be. Something simply is, to the extent that there is not even a past or a future for us to conceive of. There's something just has being versus to exist in time, which for him is called becoming. So let's reflect on that. Here I actually, this is a short little video clip that I took here. In this video clip, we see a creek. This is the Brandywine Creek, not so far from where I live, near Hibernia, in a Hibernia Park, near Chambers Lake. And you can see off in the corner there, I don't know if you see my son Dominic, sort of sitting on a rock. And why do I put this here? Well, there's an important ancient Greek philosopher who was what we'll call a pre-Socratic, right? Meaning that he wrote before Socrates. Oops, let me stop this video. We don't need it going anymore. He wrote before Socrates and actually had an important influence on Socrates. And this guy's name was Heraclitus, right? And he didn't really write anything that still exists. In fact, the only things that the only writings we have of him are just like little tiny aphorisms or little tiny segments that from quotations from other people who wrote. But one very interesting quote that is attributed to Heraclitus is this idea. He's attributed to saying something along these lines: "You cannot step in the same river twice." Now, what does that mean? Why can't you step in the same river twice? Well, for Socrates, he said that you can't step in the same river, or Socrates, not for Socrates, excuse me. Socrates might think about this phrase, inspired by Heraclitus, to say, well, why can't you step in the same river twice? Well, every moment in time, as you go to the river is always flowing, right? And because it's always flowing, the river is always changing. It's never just staying the same. The river just won't stay the same and be what it is. And it's always becoming something different, right? And so while you could step into something that has the same name, you know, has the same name. That's called the Brandywine Creek. It's still called that. Is it truly the same river? Well, in Heraclitus' statement, you would say, well, no, you can't step in the same river twice because it's constantly changing at every moment in time, right? And so this is a notion that was inspirational for Plato and Socrates. They took this idea very seriously, inspired by Heraclitus. The seriousness of looking at how everything in our experience seems to be constantly changing, always changing, to the point where Plato doesn't talk about the existence of something in time as being, but he calls it, as we said, becoming, right? Just another example to reflect on here. Here's one. Maybe you can figure this out. Oh, there's a baby, right? Okay. All right. Here's someone else. All right. There's, I guess, well, maybe it's not someone else. Maybe these are the same people. There's another picture of the person, and there's another one. Okay. Wow. What happened there? That's third grade. Guess what? That's John Zach. And that's John Zach, and that's John Zach, and that's John Zach, and that's John Zach, and that's John Zach. So, yeah, that was an interesting time. Yeah, that's me. I was a Boy Scout, and I had a mullet. And you might notice there I had braces, and not only did I have braces, I had like headgear. Like I actually had this metal piece that would have to stick in my mouth. And when I slept at night, there was this big metal thing that was stuck. So for at least a year of my childhood, I couldn't sleep on the side of my face. I had to sleep perfectly flat on my back. But I won a lot of Pinewood Derbies in my as a Weeblo. There's me in 8th grade or so, I think, playing soccer. I had those classes. There's me and my dad sometime in high school. And let's see. Oh, there's me also in high school playing in a band. You might try to guess which one is me. I'm the bass player, sort of in the center there with the Dare t-shirt on. That's me playing bass. There's me as a senior in high school. That's a little out of order. There's me as a sophomore in high school. There's me first year of grad school at some point after college and studying philosophy in graduate school. There's me a couple years ago with my daughter Madeline, and there's a whole bunch of pictures of me. So you might reflect, like, which one of these is John Zach? Oh, you might say all of them are John Zach. I mean, all of these people are named John Zach. But let me ask you this: are all of these people the same people? Is every single one of these people the same? No. I mean, if you were to talk to like the babe, for you guys, that would be over here. If you were to talk to that baby, you wouldn't be able to get very far. Every single person here, when you talk to them, it's almost like they're different people. Now they have, as we go further and further in time, like the John Zach that's there with Madeline, like he has a history that included all those other folks. But even at the moment when you were to meet him right then, he wouldn't be that same person. If you were to talk to me right now, I'm not even really that guy anymore. Here's this weird thing. Like sometimes as you go to college, you spend a lot of time with folks in high school and grade school and stuff, and maybe you knew people for a long time. But you'll find some folks, even freshmen in college, will attest, even after you've been there for like a couple months and you come back and you meet people that you had known for years, all of a sudden they're not the same anymore. They're not. Maybe that won't happen quite as dramatically now that so many of us are going to school online. I don't know. Maybe people will stay more the same. But actually, people change a lot in that time. It takes it's not until you're an adult where you seem to like not change as much. But even as adult, people are always changing, right? Just wait until you meet me. I'm very curious what that kind of person I'll be when I'm like 80. What kind of guy will I be? I don't even know. But the idea is who is John Zach? It's like John Zach doesn't even have any being. All John Zach is becoming. And every moment in time of my existence, I'm constantly becoming a new kind of person. And you are too. Even as you're here right now watching this, you're not quite the same person you were when you started these series of lectures, right? And you're not going to be the same person at the end of this day or the end of this course. That things are constantly changing, right? And so to go back to Heraclitus, you can't step in the same river twice. This was inspirational for Plato in this notion of becoming and this description of how everything that we seem to experience in our existence seems to have this property of becoming, seems to be something that's temporal, existing in time. And because it exists in time, it's constantly changing from what it is into something else. And so now let's reflect on this fundamental metaphysical distinction and how it's connected to knowledge, right? So remember, we said early on that knowledge is a kind of justified true belief, right? And I really want to emphasize this sort of ultimately metaphysical dimension to thinking about knowledge in this way, right? Knowledge is grasping the definition, right? Knowledge requires grasping the fundamental definition of a thing. And we'll see how that plays out in this definition as well too, right? So when we think about knowledge, we have to get to what's true. And what's true is ultimately correctly describing what is. And so if we really know something, we have a correct account about the nature of reality itself. We have to get to what actually is the case. But notice that we just said that only thing that really is eternal. And the things that exist in time are constantly becoming and not truly is. So this leads us to wonder about how that connects to time. So there's two kinds of things that we'll have to consider here when we're really trying to get to the metaphysical nature of knowledge. We need to think about both the knower, right? The person who's doing the knowing, and then the thing that we're going to know. Say, I want to understand justice, the nature of justice itself. I need to understand something about the nature of me and the nature of justice to understand justified true belief. So when I look at the person, when I look at me as an individual, thinking about something and thinking that I know something, there's two things that I realize. First, that when I have knowledge, there's some kind of certainty I have in my belief. This is almost like a kind of description of a psychological state about me. You can't have knowledge unless you're in this kind of psychological state of certainty that you know. But that certainty has to be grounded. It has to be grounded on something that's justified. There has to be evidence that fundamentally backs up my belief in my certainty, right? But even those things need to be grounded even further, because if I'm going to have certainty, I'm going to have evidence, that has to be grounded on an accurate description of the very thing that I want to know in and of itself. It's important that therefore the kind of object that I grasp has the kind of characteristics that's required for me to know. Right? If I only can know what really is the case, then there must be some way that the object itself that I'm going to know has to have some kind of existence. It has to be able to be known. It has to be in a certain way so that I could accurately describe it in what it is. So in order for me to be able to know justice, it's not enough for me to just have certainty or for me to have evidence. Justice must be primarily the kind of thing that can be known, something that has a kind of state of existence that can be correctly described, and I need to somehow grasp that. So it needs to be the kind of object that can be known. Okay? So that might seem kind of abstract. Let's connect it back to even Heraclitus a little bit, right? Heraclitus, as we were talking about the river that is constantly changing, and we had this notion of becoming in Plato, we can have this fundamental principle that Plato would say that if the nature of a thing is to always change from what it is, it fundamentally can't be known, because if knowledge fundamentally is grasping what the truth of what something is, then it has to actually have some stability. If something is always changing, how can you know it? As soon as you try to describe it, it's already changed into being something else. So it needs to have some stability. Well, if from Heraclitus, everything that we observe, emphasis on what we observe, always seems to be changing, right? Here I have this little image of a tree that sort of is going through phases of its life. And if something is always changing, then how can it be known? Well, if everything that we observe is always changing, then it can't be known at all. And so this is this first sort of challenge, a kind of skeptical challenge to whether knowledge is even possible at all. In order for us to know something, there ultimately has to be something that just is, that is not always changing, right? In order for there to be something that is not always changing, what the heck would that be, right? It seems like everything that we observe, as we said, is always changing. Are there examples of this? Well, actually, Plato thinks there are. There are things that don't change. And so let's get some examples now. So what are something that's always staying the same and never changing? Well, in a less interesting sense, we could say something that doesn't change would be something like the past, right? There's things that I did in my past that I wish I could change, but I can't. There's some things that I did that I wish I hadn't done. And there's things that happened that I wish never happened. But the past is what it is. And actually that, as Plato would say, is actually the wrong word. That's not even the correct way of saying it. The past was what it was. The past doesn't exist anymore. It can't change because it doesn't exist, right? And so we can't change what doesn't exist anymore. There's nothing to be done. Now, actually, just as an aside, I love science fiction, and maybe you like science fiction too. There's plenty of great science fiction movies where people, travel through time and change the past and change the future and all kinds of greatness. But just as an aside, that's not inconsistent with what I just said here. You still can't change the past. The only way that you would be able to change the past is if somehow you made the past present again. And that's really what happens when someone changes the past. They don't change the past from the present. They change the past by making the past present again. Now, we make the past present again all the time in our memories, but it's not present in its actual existence. It has a kind of existence that's left over in our remembering of it, just in our own heads. But the only way to really make the past different is for us to somehow get back there and make it no longer past, but present itself. The only time we can do anything is right now. It's literally impossible to do anything in the future, or literally impossible to do something in the past. Okay, so that's not that exciting. History happened. That's not just what Plato wants to talk about. When Plato is trying to get to the answer to philosophical questions, he's not just asking questions about the past. That's not interesting to him. So what's something else that never changes? Math. Math for Plato doesn't change. He would say mathematical facts, mathematical truths are true even if no one existed to think them, right? 2 plus 3 would still equal 5, even if no one had developed the symbols that we use for 2 and 3 and 5. Math is something that's inherently existing in and of itself, regardless of anything else. And we could see that math doesn't change in some ways. It's for Plato, math is truly eternal. Now, Plato is going to think about some other things too. Plato is going to talk about these universal forms, and he's going to say that they also have a kind of eternal existence, and they're the kinds of things that we can know. And what does he mean by the universal forms? Well, I'll try to give you a sense of that now, but we're really going to explore fully the concept of the universal forms and the last module of discussing Plato, and so that's for next week. But now we're still just going to set up that problem. To set that up, this was a whole lot of PowerPoint. Let's go and let's actually take a look at a text. Let's take a look at Plato's Cratylus. And Plato's Cratylus has some interesting things to say about the nature of knowledge, right? And its relationship to words and ultimately some things that point to the existence of these universal forms. We also see, in essence, the same kind of skeptical argument about the existence of knowledge that I just sort of presented here in the PowerPoint. So in the Cratylus, just some background. The Cratylus is an interesting discussion between Socrates and, fancily enough, a guy named Cratylus. And they spent a lot of time talking about language and words. And at the very end of this dialogue, they're drawing some conclusions about the nature of words. Cratylus sort of presents this view that language has, that there's such thing as almost like a natural language, right? That there's particular sounds and symbols, but in particular sounds that are sort of like the true words for things, right? Now, this goes completely against one of our first lectures on Plato when we said that where do words and language come from? They come from people. They come from a sort of agreement between people. The sound that we use for dog is arbitrary. It doesn't really matter, right? But it means that the word dog that we can utter or we can write down means what it does because of a kind of agreement between humans. Well, Cratylus actually presented a kind of old idea that maybe there was a language that pre-existed all other languages. It was sort of like the true language, and that there's sort of a natural word for something that's not just arbitrary. Plato did not believe in this, right? But it's an interesting thought. It's actually kind of connected, just as an aside as well, too. It's kind of connected to almost our notion of spells and witchcraft and things like that, that somehow there's like this magical true language that actually gives power. But we'll set that aside. And so here, as Plato is talking to Cratylus about natural language and all that, he kind of gets to some fundamental conclusions about this tension between words and the reality itself. And so let's read together just a little bit here. So this is the bottom of the reading that I posted online. He says, Socrates says, still let's investigate one further issue so as to avoid being deceived by the fact that so many of these names seem to lean in the same direction, as will be if, as it seems to me to be the case, the name givers really did give them the belief that everything is always moving, right? So that there is this belief that everything is always moving and flowing. This should remind you a little bit of Heraclitus, right? This idea that everything is in constant change, everything is constant flux. And he says, and as it happens, so Socrates says, the name givers thought that everything is always moving and flowing, but he says, and it happens, things aren't really that way at all, but the name givers themselves have fallen into a kind of vortex and are whirled around in it, dragging us with them. So consider, Cratylus, a question that I, for my part, often dream about. And now here's where we get to the interesting thing. Are we or aren't we to say that there is a beautiful itself and a good itself, and the same for each one of the things that are? So this is an interesting question, right? In Cratylus, we immediately have this distinction between, and we'll talk primarily on beauty, but he also mentions the good. He says, is there such thing as a beauty itself or a good in itself, right? So what does he mean by that? Well, he's drawing a distinction here between what he'll call beauty itself versus, say, beautiful things, okay? So let's keep reading. Cratylus says, I think we are. So Socrates says, let's not investigate whether a particular face or something of that sort is beautiful then. or whether all such things seem to be flowing, but let's ask this instead. Are we to say that the beautiful itself is always such as it is, right? And so again, Plato is saying we don't want to just think about, we need to draw a distinction between, say, a particular beautiful face and beauty itself. What does he mean by that? Just think about something that's beautiful or a beautiful face. Can you think of someone who has a beautiful face? Think of someone right now, right? Every time I teach this class in person, I always ask people to actually give a name, and maybe we Google search that person. I think one of the most recent example I can recall, you know what, this actress's name, I might be mispronouncing it. The recent example I can remember someone giving was Zendaya. Isn't that how you say it? I know you're not here to tell me, but Zendaya. She was in the Spider-Man movies, and I actually just saw a trailer. She's going to be in some remake of a Dune movies based on Frank Herbert's Dune. Herbert's, is it Herbert or Herbert? And see, now all sorts of things I can't keep straight. But anyway, think of a very beautiful person, right, and their beautiful face. Is that the same thing as beauty itself? Well, beautiful things are just what we observe in the world, right? But when we look at beautiful things, or say this beautiful rose that I have right there, they're beautiful in a moment, but they're always changing. At some time, they're not beautiful anymore, right? There was a time that a beautiful thing was not beautiful, and then a time that it will be beautiful, and then a time that it won't be beautiful anymore. That beautiful thing is constantly changing. But when we talk about beauty itself for Plato, he's talking about something that's more than just something that's constantly changing. It's more than just what we observe in any particular beautiful objects, right? So it's when I look at a beautiful face, for Plato, it's pointing me towards, causing me to remember beauty itself, to go beyond and outside just that individual object in its own isolation, but drawing towards what Plato would call beauty itself. No one thing possesses all of beauty. And you could think of a beautiful piece of music, right? Say the Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven or something like that, right? Or you could think of a beautiful action, like a person who did some self-sacrificing act for someone else. That's a beautiful action, right? We could think about the beautiful rose, but all of them contain beauty, and none of them contain all of beauty, though. Beauty is more than just some beautiful thing, right? And so what Plato is going to say is to say, while some beautiful thing can change in how it ultimately shows beauty, beauty itself for him doesn't change at all. Now, you might raise as an objection to this, that common phrase, right? People say all the time, like, oh, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? Different people find different things beautiful, right? And so like, there's this person right here, and they have their sort of view of what's beautiful. Like they're looking at something and they might say like, hey, that's beautiful. And B-A-U-T, beautiful. And then some other person over here might look at the same thing and they'll say ugly, right? They don't notice the beauty, right? And so what's the truth? What's the truth here? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. What this person finds beautiful, this person doesn't, right? And so that would make it seem like maybe beauty itself is always changing. This person says this thing is beautiful, and this person says something else is beautiful. That beauty seems to be always changing, not just the objects themselves. But for Plato, he's got an answer to this. He's going to say, right? This person sees something. All right, that this guy misses. This guy misses, right? And so this guy right here fails to notice something about reality itself. That beauty, right? Beauty for Plato really is one thing. Now, different people in different times in history might see beauty in different things. They might notice beauty in different kinds of people or different kinds of objects or different kinds of experiences, but the beauty itself remains constant, right? And to some extent, people can actually be right and wrong about beauty then, right? So when this person says that this is something that's beautiful, they very likely correctly see some truth about beauty itself present in whatever that beautiful object is, right? And this person who calls it ugly very likely is missing that beauty. Sometimes it might even go the opposite, though. Maybe the person who calls it ugly actually has the truth, and this person is calling something beautiful that inherently is not, right? And that can happen too. But more often than not, the person who's noticing beauty in something, it's the fault in the person who calls it ugly for lacking to see that beauty that exists there. So for Plato, beauty itself fundamentally has a kind of unchanging, eternal nature. It's what we'll see he calls a kind of metaphysical form. It's that true fundamental definition of beauty, which for Plato, he thinks transcends any particular object. Different objects that are constantly changing. And so when you see, to go back to like the example of something that's constantly changing, when you see a flower that once was beautiful and then becomes ugly, the fact that it became ugly doesn't change the fact that it was once beautiful. What made it beautiful at the time it was beautiful really did make it beautiful. And beauty was that one thing, even if the particular thing that we call beautiful is changing in its own nature. Beauty itself for Plato stays the same while the things that we might call beautiful are constantly changing. And so it is possible to have knowledge about beauty for Plato. Why? Because he thinks beauty itself continues to exist in an unchanging way, in an eternal way, even if the things that we try to call beautiful are constantly changing, right? Now, this is deeply connected, and we can see this within the Cratylus as well, right? So let's keep reading in the Cratylus and just see how some of these ideas were present here, right? So he said, let's not investigate a particular face. Are we to say that beauty itself is always such as it is? Cratylus says, absolutely. So Socrates says, but if it is always passing away, right? Things that are always passing away, like beautiful faces, can we correctly say of it can we correctly say of it first that it is this, and then that it is such and such? Or at the very instant we're speaking, isn't it inevitably and immediately becoming a different thing and altering and no longer being as it was, right? So this is Socrates reflecting on becoming, on things that exist in time, constantly changing, and saying, guess what? There's no way to correctly describe something that is constantly changing, because as soon as we describe it one way, it's already becoming something different. So Socrates says, and Cratylus says, okay. So Socrates says, then it never stays the same. How can it be something? It can't even be. All it is becoming. After all, if it ever stays the same, it clearly isn't changing, at least not during that time. And if it's always stays the same and is always the same thing, so that it never departs from its own form, how can it ever change or move, right? So something that is eternal can't ever change at all. If it participates in change in any way, then for Plato, it's participating in becoming. And now this is where he connects it to epistemology, to knowledge. Then again, it can't even be known by anyone, right? So this is fundamentally Socrates' little anticipation of that principle, that the only thing that can be known is something that always stays the same. And if something is changing, then it can't be known. For at the very instant the knower to be approaches, what he is approaching is becoming a different thing, of a different character, so that he can't yet come to know either what sort of thing it is or what it is like. Surely no kind of knowledge is knowledge of what isn't in any way. Cratylus says that's right. So Socrates says, indeed, it isn't even reasonable to say that there is such a thing as knowledge, Cratylus, if all things are passing on and none remain. So for Socrates, he's strong here. He's saying that if really Heraclitus perfectly described all of reality, there is no knowledge, right? All there would be is opinion. All there's opinion of things that are constantly changing. But for Socrates and for Plato, there is something that's always the same. And that's the fundamental definitions of things that we're going to see, which are the forms. And we'll explore that, like I said, more in class next week. Let's keep reading. On the other hand, if the very form of knowledge passed on from being knowledge, the instant it passed on into a different form than that of knowledge, there would be no knowledge. In other words, Plato says, if you know something, then you know something. And if you don't know something, you don't know something. You can't. Knowledge doesn't change. If something truly is knowledge, it's always correct. because it either correctly describes reality or it doesn't. There is no such thing as finding out something that you knew was wrong. You just never knew it. It was never knowledge. And if you really do know something, then you're knowing something that's in and of itself eternal, right? And if it were always passing on, there would always be no knowledge. Hence, on this account, no one could know anything and nothing could be known either. But this is where Socrates is going to get to the possibility of knowledge. But if there is always that which knows and that which is known, if there are such things as the beautiful, the good, and each one of the things that are, it doesn't appear to me that these things can't be at all like the flowings or motions, as we were saying just now that they were. So whether I'm right about these things or whether the truth lies with Heraclitus gets a little nod here, and many others, isn't an easy answer to investigate. But surely no one with any understanding will commit himself or the cultivation of his soul to names or trust them and their givers to the point of firmly stating that he knows something, condemning both himself and the things that are totally unsound, like leaky sinks, or believe things that are exactly like people with runny noses, or that all things are afflicted with colds and drip over everything. It's certainly possible that things are this way, Cratylus, but it's also possible that they are not. So notice that Socrates is not really thinking that he gave a definitive art. He didn't give a proof for the possibility of knowledge here. He's just saying it's possible that that beauty itself, that good itself, that justice itself, and all these things really are unchanging, and therefore knowledge is possible, right? He said he doesn't say that I've proven it. He says we can at least think about this and realize it's possible. So you must investigate them courageously and thoroughly, and not accept anything easily. Ooh, that's Socrates telling us to be philosophers. You must be courageous and thorough and not accept anything easily, because that's not what Socrates does with anyone, right? You are still young and in your prime after all. Then after you've investigated them, if you happen to discover the truth, you can share it with me. So he says, come on, man, become a philosopher, investigate this. And so what does Cratylus say? I'll do that. But I assure you, Socrates, that I have already investigated them and have taken a lot of trouble over the matter, and things seem to be very much more as Heraclitus says they were. So Cratylus is kind of on Heraclitus' side. Instruct me about another time, Cratylus, after you go back. But now go off into the country as if you were planning to, and Hermogenes will see you on your way. And Cratylus says, I'll do that, Socrates, but I hope that you'll also continue to think about these matters yourself. So this is an interesting end to a dialogue. This isn't our traditional true aporia. We actually tend to have we have Cratylus, who sort of stands on his own 2 feet and kind of still says he thinks what he does, and Socrates says, I kind of think what I do. And Cratylus doesn't ever really become the philosopher that Socrates wants him to be. Cratylus doesn't go courageously and thoroughly and not accept anything easily, at least not in Socrates' view. And so maybe he's left dissatisfied with Cratylus. But he's also, for us, posited the possibility of knowledge, right? And actually, interestingly enough, the next text that follows here is the Theaetetus in history, and where we see our definition of knowledge. And so Socrates challenges us to see that there is a possibility of knowledge, but it'll only stand if there is things that are eternal. And so that's, like I mentioned multiple times, that's what we're going to investigate in our next module about what it takes for there to be truly eternal objects. What does that actually mean for Plato? And what are these forms in reality, these unchanging definitions of things? And then that will be Plato's fundamental metaphysical foundation for epistemology, and then ultimately for ethics. So, all right, my friends, I hope you had a good time thinking about some of these ideas here this week, and I will catch you on the flip side. Have a beautiful day.